Hey, Legal Amigo here. This is my first podcast. We have the legendary Dr. Mario Garcia with us. And you are a Chicano history professor. You helped invent the field, really. I mean, for any of you listening, please check him out, Mario T. Garcia. Lots of books on Mexican American history, Chicano history, Latino history, sort of from 1880 through today. Lots of great biographies. You've written books about Catholic priests. You've written books about Latino leaders, Chicano leaders, and you're working on a book right now about a Chicano artist. And we were talking before we started recording because I have had this book since I was 10 years old, and it's one of your books. And it's about a generation of Mexican Americans my grandfather was part of, and my grandfather helped you in your research in
Yeah.
El Paso, and you're from El Paso. My mom's from El Paso, my grandfather, and your parents, of course. And it it it's been in my subconscious. It's been in my subconscious because we were talking about how I went to Stanford for college and law school. I was a government nerd. I thought the system was a way to change things, and it took me getting up close to the system to have a lot of questions about the system. So
I can
anybody who's
imagine.
watching this because they've seen my videos on TikTok, they know how I feel. It's
Wow.
just so
Yeah,
corrupt.
of
Um,
course.
it's just
Yeah.
so corrupt. And we started talking. I hit record because we started talking about what's happening today with ICE.
Yeah.
And you were
Well, I was
saying,
saying
yeah,
that the system is really even more stacked now. The system has always been stacked in many ways. When you go back, even if you look at the Constitution, it's stacked against poor people, working people, certainly women. Look, the slaves were considered only two-thirds of a person. The Constitution is always stacked. What has happened over the whatever number of years since then has been that there have been people, including minorities like Chicanos, Latinos, and others, blacks certainly, who have been working to refashion that Constitution, to enlarge it, to make it more democratic. And we've made a lot of strides in that, but still there's been a lot of still roadblocks and uh, obstacles to fully engaging, so that all people are treated totally equally and have equal opportunities. And of course, we're seeing with Trump, the first administration, and now rolling back even more our liberties, our freedom of expression, our freedom of assembly, and then to be protected against unlawful seizures and so forth. So, I mean, I just cringe as I see these images on TV or in the LA Times of people just being treated so horribly. Why do they have to, each person that they supposedly think have broken the law in some ways, but why do 3, 4, 5 of these big, heavy guys, and they're all big guys, with their masks on and they're armed and they have all of that equipment. Why do 4 or 5 of them have to jump on one person? I mean, they're big enough that they don't even have to jump on them. People will, they're not going to fight back. They're not crazy. They see that they're carrying weapons. They're not going to. Well, why are they? Every single time I see something like that, it's jumping on people. They even did it to Alex Padilla, the senator. They jumped on him, and so this is horrible. This is a very, very trying times, and so that's part of, I think, of the system being stacked. I know it is part of the system being stacked, and the only way, historically and even now, is for people to fight back, not violently, not with arms, but like the marches that we've seen. Uh, you know, and July 4th was still another example, but the ones on the King Day, supposedly we don't accept a king. There was demonstrations, huge ones all over the place. Here in Santa Barbara, we went to our local one. There was about 10,000 people. We're a small city, 80,000. That was huge. So only by people fighting back, and that's been part of my work as a historian, to show how people have fought back against the system, the stacked system, to try to gain more freedom, more liberties, more abilities to have mobility, to have a good life, and so forth. So I think that's the solution. I tell that to my students. I mean, it's not it's not like we don't know what to do. History tells us what to do. Only when people mobilize and bring resources together and bring their bodies together. It's people power. People power. We've seen it in different periods. We saw it in the civil rights movement led by Dr. King. Look at that tremendous, huge, peaceful demonstrations and marches, that eventually forced the system to begin to change somewhat through engaging in establishing civil rights laws and so forth, although the Supreme Court has rolled some of those back as well. So it's always that struggle between the attempt to enlarge democracy and freedom in this country against the efforts by those who want to restrain that or to roll it back.
Yeah, the point you made about why are 4 or 5 200+ pound men jumping on people, that's what I've been asking. Like, it's one thing. Okay, the orange man, I call him the orange man. The orange man won the election. He won the election. It's it's unfortunate as far as I'm concerned, but he won, and so he ran on a platform that he was going to deport people. Okay, fine. Unfortunate, but that's the mandate he had. But to me, yeah, I agree. Like, or what I hear you saying, or what I think is, so much of it is like how they're doing it, like the vitriol, like the ugliness.
No, right. I mean, you see hatred in their faces. You see hatred in Trump. You see hatred in all the people around him. They hate other people. They hate especially non-white people. And that comes through. They don't, for years you've heard the cry from the political right, I want my country back. And I tell my students, what country? In their country? It's my country too. It's our country too. I mean, I want my country back. What they're really saying is, I want my white country back. I want my white country back because they're fearful of all the demographic changes. And that's also very significant today. Demographically, this country has changed considerably in the last 150 years, even more, so that we're very close in many areas. Well, we live in California in a, what do they call it, a majority-minority population, and that's happening in many other parts of the country. And it's estimated that about 2050, more or less, there will be more people of color than white people in this country. And so that's part of the fear. That's part of the fear that somehow we represent something that is dangerous to the history of this country or the Constitution, such as it is, and so forth, which it isn't. All people are fighting for, as I've said, is to enlarge that democracy, to expand it. Not to destroy it, but to expand it. The ones who are destroying democracy are Trump and his people that are trying to roll back the liberties and gains that people who have struggled for civil rights and human rights in this country have been struggling on for years. And so it's not a secret or a mystery of how to fight back. History tells us how to fight back. So we have the Chicano movement,
human power,
so-called direct action into the streets. Why? Because, as you started earlier, Stefan, you can't really trust the system. The system is stacked in favor of rich white people. And that was from the very beginning, right? And if not, they would have included, they would have freed the slaves and included them as part of the country. They would have given women the right to vote. They would have given people who didn't own property, like a lot of people who were basically working people, they would have given them the right to vote, but of course they didn't. So, the whole point is, I think that history tells us how we've been able to enlarge democratic rights, and that is through people just coming together, using their bodies, people power, direct action, peacefully in the streets, engaging in the electoral system where gains can be made that will enlarge that democratic freedom. So there are ways to do it, but we all remember from our childhood, what's the remedy to stand up to a bully? You know, what do we do? If you do nothing, if you just allow that bully to continue to pester you, it's going to continue until finally you give that bully a good shove. I don't say hit him, but give him a good shove, or get right in his face and say, the next time you do this, man, you're in deep trouble. But you got to react. You got to react against the bully. So we're seeing the bullies out in the streets. We see the bullies in the White House and in these cabinet positions and so forth. So I think, what's good is to see that people are reacting this way. Again, the protests we've seen, the demonstrations.
You mentioned the No Kings protests, like 4 or 5 million people came out. And I mean, even in my neighborhood, which is a little closed off, like people aren't usually here. There are people all over in the streets out, like being loud. And I thought to myself, if we do this once a week for 6 months, we're good. Or once a week for 2 years, however long it takes. But it's got to be more than once, right?
Yeah, and it's got to be organized and strategic. People have to come together and organize and so forth. I mean, when I say direct action and so forth, but yeah, people need to come together, people power, but at some point it has to come together and be organized. So you're an organized series of groups that are fighting back. Yeah, it's
particular strategy and energy towards a particular goal. Yes.
Yeah, and education is a very important part of this, because I've been reading up on how authoritarian governments establish themselves. You use the example, for example, of Nazi Germany, but one could use other examples. One of the first things that authoritarian movements do is to try to go right at the educational system, go right at education, limit it or destroy it or control it, because education is a way for people to begin to think critically. And if you're just trying to establish an authoritarian and even fascist society, you don't want thinking people. You don't want people that will have critical thoughts. You don't want people with too much knowledge of history or how things have evolved, how things evolve. You want to limit that. So we need to continue to insist that all of our people need good education. They need access to good education. It means continued access to college, to graduate schools, and so forth. And notice how the Trump administration has gone right at the educational system at all levels, at the universities, to try to intimidate them in terms of what they try to do at Harvard, still trying to do, control their curriculum. And the whole idea of saying you have to show only the good side of American history, whatever that might mean. What is the good side of American history? That's a way of controlling education. He told Harvard, we want to be able to, the government, his administration, have an input into what faculty you hire, because you don't want faculty that are critical, that have critical views of society and so forth. So, yes, direct action, protests, but we need to protect what we already have, and we need to make sure that all of our citizens, Chicanos, Latinos, and all others, get a good education, but a good education that shows a young person to begin to think critically, to ask questions of why? Why do we still have racism? Why do we still have sexism? Have a critical consciousness. When I did my book, my testimonial of Sal Castro, the inspirational teacher who influenced the students in 1968 to go out in protest from the East LA schools in what came to be known as the walkouts. Well, they came to be known first as the blowouts. But the walkouts, some 20,000 or plus students, not only in East LA, but in other parts, but led by the students in LA, walked out against the whole history of discriminatory and racist education against Mexican Americans, limited education, emphasis more on vocational rather than kids thinking with their heads and so forth. But Sal told me, he said, what these kids are getting is not real knowledge. It's not real, how did he put it? It's not real education. It's really training to basically accept the status quo and not to ask questions like why. Like I tell my students, we got to be like scientists. They're always asking why in terms of their fields of science. But we have to do it in terms of those who study, history, who study society. Why also? And what Sal was saying, real education, real knowledge is when you train students to begin to have a critical perspective on their realities and ask why is my family doesn't seem to have as many resources as white families, or why am I in a school that doesn't seem to emphasize for us to go to college and so forth, which was happening in the kids in the 60s. And those walkouts, that blowouts were in 68. And that was still at the time when there was still all that U.S. involvement in Vietnam. And it was discovered that Chicanos, along with blacks, were disproportionately being drafted to go fight that war in Vietnam. And so Sal said in 68, in the East LA high schools like Lincoln High School and Roosevelt High School, etc., Belmont and others, on any given day or any given week, there would be more military recruiters at these schools than college recruiters. He said, what does that tell you right there?
Yeah, and I don't know that
one of the students, Harry Gamboa, famous artist now, who went to Roosevelt, he said already in 68, we had a kind of wall of honor for the kids who already had been sent to Vietnam and been killed. We already had a wall of honor for that. So we need to make sure that we still continue to promote critical education, critical thinking, because that's one way of fighting back. The lack of a critical perspective, I think, led to the unfortunate election of Trump last year.
Okay, I was going to ask you about that, and I was going to ask you why so many Latinos supported Trump.
Yeah, 48%. I couldn't believe it. 48% of Latino men voted for Trump. 48%. 38% of Latina women voted for Trump. Those were record highs voting for Republican presidential candidates. And I think a lot of it has to do, again, with a lack of critical ways of looking at things, a lack of critical thinking, so that they look behind what Trump was saying. I can reduce the prices of our groceries and the prices of eggs almost immediately. Come on. How much does the president do? How much can a president control the price of groceries, I'm sure that if Biden was able to control the price of groceries, he would have done that and brought the prices of eggs down. A lot of people voted for Trump because of the prices of eggs. Can you believe that? I mean, that's not critical thinking. That's just voting kind of emotionally. You got to be able to think about what these people are saying, go beyond the rhetoric of the politicians and understand what they're really saying. I mean, and with Trump, it wasn't like there was a blank slate. We had 4 years of Trump won. What did people get out of that? And working people, poor people, minorities got very little out of Trump. Well, what does that tell you? You have to, bring that critical perspective. I think a lot of that lack of critical consciousness, Stefan, had a lot to do with it. People, we have never had a good educational system. Too much of our public education still is inadequate, and kids are not trained to think critically. We still have a lot of kids that don't go on to even community colleges. Our dropout rates are still too high. So people have no way of really thinking through these things. It's unfortunate.
I was going to ask you if you thought that there have been improvements since 1968, because I'd like to believe there have been. But I know when I was in high school in the 90s that there were still a whole lot of military recruiters on the east side and not on the west side. The college recruiters were on the west side. And I still know there were low expectations of of people on the East Side, including me, of where I was going to go to college and less encouragement than, you know, Anglo or other students. And
Well, I think, I like to look on the positive side of things. If you look at it historically, yes, there has been improvements, of course. The Chicano movement, including the blowouts, did begin to change the system to some degree.
Okay.
And to me, the greatest accomplishments of the Chicano movement of the 60s into the 70s was the breakthroughs in terms of more Chicanos going on to college. So that was significant. But
Yes.
here again, notice, it wasn't, as I tell my students, it wasn't all of a sudden that high school principals and counselors all of a sudden thought, oh, gee, maybe we need to have a better way of teaching these kids so that in the minority schools, the inner city schools like East LA, that we have more college related classes, more college prep classes, and because none of that, much of that was happening. The majority of these kids were being shuttled to vocational education to learn how to do things with their hands, auto mechanics, the girls how to cook and sew. And that had a long history in this country. Mm-hmm. And we can go into that later, and also it wasn't the high school officials and school board people who all of a sudden began to kind of change things. And it wasn't college presidents or chancellors who all of a sudden began to think of saying, hey, maybe we should begin recruiting Chicanos and Latinos. And so, no, I tell my students, that's not what happened. It was the movement through mass protest and things like the walkouts forced the system to change. That's the only way the system changes. It will not change on its own because it benefits the ruling class, the ruling circles. It will not change until you begin to force it to change, pressure it to change. Does it change it completely? No, but it begins to make inroads. And so, yes, I think we're much better off today than we were back in 68. Having said that, there's still a lot of these limitations in the public schools. So many public schools now, their students are primarily students of color. And so you don't get as much quality education as there should be. So that's something that, we still have to struggle, in the community, parents, and so forth and so on. So I think that education and again, people power, all these things are the answers, and history shows us that they're the answers. And my role has been basically as a historian to examine the history of Chicanos, Mexican Americans in this country, to show the conditions that they've had to live in or under, but also especially how Chicanos have made history, how Mexican Americans have made history. I say that to me, I'm not interested in the victimization of history. Yeah. In other words, I understand that Chicanos and other minorities have been victimized by the system. I understand that, and I've written about it and researched that. But I'm also more interested in how Chicanos, for example, have made history. And one of the ways that they've done is ways that I've mentioned already through struggles and so forth. Back already in the 1930s, beginning to join the union movement. I've written about Bert Corona, that was the very first testimonial oral history that I did of Bert Corona back. It was published in, that was in 1995, I believe, or 94.
And he was a labor organizer in LA?
Oh, yeah, he was a giant in Chicano Latino history. And in the 1930s, he, by the way, was from El Paso, too. Oh, so there's an interesting El Paso connection. He graduated from El Paso High. My mother went to El Paso High. And Bert then came to LA where he had family. And he initially was at USC. And one of the things I didn't know about Bert Corona, he's a legendary figure and as a labor and community organizer. But Bert was a good basketball player at El Paso High, and he got a basketball scholarship to come to play at USC of all
No
places.
way.
However, in his first year, he got hurt, so he never really was able to continue with that or continue even his USC education. But when they brought him to USC on a basketball scholarship, he said it wasn't like the lucrative scholarships that athletes get today, where they actually may even now paid direct money. He said the scholarship was basically they got you a job that helped pay your tuition and your lodging or whatever. So they got me a job in a warehouse in the downtown area of LA in the mid 1930s, but that's at the very same time that those industries were being unionized by the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organization, which in the 1930s was very radical, very, very active, very powerful movement. And one of the unions under the CIO then was the Longshoremen's Union. And the Longshoremen's Union started a union movement in the warehouse industries in downtown LA. Like Bert worked in a drug warehouse industries that was related to the drugstores and so forth. All of the drugs that they were getting were first, brought into the warehouses. And so he was there like a stock boy or stock guy. And that industry was being unionized by the longshoremen. So Bert joined the union. He joined the Longshoremen's Union, and the rest is history. He becomes a leader in the Longshoremen's Union. He helps to unionize a lot of other industries that included people of all different backgrounds, working people, Mexican Americans, other Latinos. And he learns how to become an organizer then.
Immigrants and citizens, yeah?
Yeah, later on, because he learns how to be a good organizer. After World War II, he works with various organizations like CSO, Community Service Organization. Bert was one of the founders of MAPA, the Mexican American Political Association. But then in the 60s, he started working on the immigration issue. And Bert becomes the key leader in the Hermandad Mexicana Nacional, which is still functioning today, led by his wife and by his son. And Bert began to organize undocumented immigrants in this country, and he did it successfully. It had never been done before, to show that you could organize undocumented immigrants. And I tell my students, Bert is the urban equivalent of the rural Cesar Chavez. In what ways? Caesar showed that you could successfully organize farm workers. Never been done before. He said, si se puede, he organized them. And he showed that they had the power to establish those contracts, initial contracts. It's been a struggle, of course, but he showed that farm workers could unionize and could come together. Bert in the urban areas like LA showed that you could organize the undocumented in their own organizations like the Hermandad Mexicana Nacional. And so he becomes a legend in terms of working with the undocumented and working against anti-immigrant legislation, anti-immigrant nativist races, anti-immigrant movements, and so forth. So people like that is the kind of people that I've been interested in the history that I work on, to show how people, Chicanos, have made history, how they have developed, have had a history of strong leadership, and how you can make change, but the change has to come from the bottom. Again, I tell my students, major changes in this country have never come from the top. They've never come from the top. They always come from the bottom. People forcing the system, as I've already mentioned, to make changes, to make inroads. Well, Chicanos have had that kind of a history too. That's the reason I wrote the Mexican American book, that where I interviewed your grandfather, E.B. Leon, in El Paso, because E.B. Leon was one of the leaders of LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, in El Paso. Now, for those who are not familiar with LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, is the oldest Mexican-American civil rights organization in the country. It's still functioning, still has chapters all over the country. It was established in the late 1920s, 1929, and Texas. That's where it was founded. And then it spread to other states as well over the course of the before World War II and after World War II as well. But so in this book that I wrote called Mexican Americans, Leadership, Ideology, and Identity, 1930-1960, here I look at the origins of the Mexican American civil rights movement, which begins with groups like LULAC, but includes many others. Like after World War II, a lot of the GIs came back, Chicano GIs, and they faced still the discrimination and racism. And there's an interesting story there too. Don't want to get too diverted, but
no,
but
whatever you want to, wherever you want to go. Yeah.
Just as part of that, people don't realize, people will say, I want my country back, I want my one country back, that people of color don't, support the Constitution, don't support the Americans. I said, wait a minute. I tell my students and others, do you know that in World War II alone, 500,000 Latinos, mostly Mexican Americans, but also Puerto Ricans who are U.S. citizens, but Latinos, Mexican Americans, both U.S. citizens, and even there were several thousand Mexican immigrants who were in World War II, but altogether 500,000 Latinos out of a Latino population in 1940 of 3 million. You do the math, 500,000. That's a huge chunk of people. And I say, and they weren't fighting for Mexico.
Yeah.
They were fighting for us. They were fighting for the United States. And they fought bravely. Per capita, they won the largest percentage of Congressional Medal of Honor winners, the highest honor of showing valor in battle. Many never came back. Many came back wounded physically, psychologically. And at that time, there was no way of dealing with these types of traumas from wartime. So,
yeah, my grandfather was awarded a Purple Heart. Yeah,
there you go.
Part of that. Yeah,
there you go, E.B. Leon. And so we've given a lot to this country. Yes. Chicanos have given a lot to us. You have, for example, I've written my first book. My first book, which is called Desert Immigrants, the Mexicans of El Paso.
I forgot El Paso is a desert town. Yeah, I don't know why I forgot. I used to visit every winter. I guess because I was there in the winter, it wasn't as hot. But I love Joshua Tree now, and that figures. It's like,
well, it's desert, but it's high desert country too. It's got the southern extension of the Rockies, and but so I did the history of El Paso of 1880, 1920, and it's really a history. It's related to my family. Because my family, on my mother's side, come to El Paso at that time from Mexico. Between the late 19th century and 1930, it's estimated that 1 million or more Mexican immigrants came to the United States. This is important because a lot of people still have the belief that Mexicans and other Latinos are the last of the immigrants. No.
Why is that? Why do people believe that?
They're not the last of the immigrants.
Do people think that because it's ongoing waves of immigration?
Yes, of course, it is. And one of the distinctions about Latinos in this country, like Mexicans, is that we're both old and new. Mm-hmm. Old in the sense that some, like in New Mexico, can trace their ancestry going back to the early Spanish settlements back in the 1600s. Mm-hmm. You find families around Santa Fe and they trace their ancestry not just so much to more contemporary immigrants, but way back to those early Spanish settlements that the Spanish who began to mix with the Native Americans of that area. Uh-huh. But we're new because, Stefan, in the 30, 40 minutes that we've been talking, we don't know how many people have crossed the border. Mm. And even though Trump has sealed the border lock, some people are still coming across. Mm. So they're new in that sense. we as Chicanos and Latinos have that distinctive history that no other ethnic group has had. It's both old and new. They've had continuing movement across what eventually becomes the U.S.-Mexico border, or they were already here.
I was
As
going to
people
say,
say,
there's some other distinctions too, right? We were
yeah,
here, and there's
that's
new
right. And
waves.
the popular saying for that is that for those people, they didn't come to the border came to them after the U.S. conquered what was Mexican territory from Texas to California in the 1840s. So,
Is that part of it too,
mm,
that we're a conquered people? Like, is there some psychology both within us and within Anglos about that plays into the dynamic?
we're very poor at history. So, we're poor at history, and that's part of lacking a critical knowledge of how we approach things like presidential elections. You know, uh, you know, if, if a lot of the people who voted for Trump trace their ancestry to earlier immigrants. For example, many who came at the turn of the 20th century from Eastern Europe, from Poland, from Russia, from Lithuania, and from Southern Europe, which like the Italians and Greeks and so forth. And all of those people, Eastern and Southern Europeans, when they first came in the early 20th century, were treated horribly,
Yeah.
horribly, discriminated, segregated, looked down upon. Even before that, when the Irish came in the 1840s and 1850s, they were treated horribly too.
Yeah.
Especially because they were entering into a predominantly Protestant country. And the Irish, of course, were primarily Catholics, and there was strong anti-Catholic sentiment. Do you know that other people would often refer to Irish Catholics using the N-word? The N-word, that's what they called them.
Really?
The N-word. There's a book that
Oh, I
came
didn't
out a
know
few
that.
years ago called How the Irish Became White.
Huh.
And that is to say that after a generation or so, they were more acceptable as white people, but not their initial ancestors. The same thing with the Eastern and Southern Europeans. They were treated horribly. Most of them were not even seen as part of the white race. They were seen as part of an inferior race. Italian immigrants who, most of them settled in the East and Midwest, but some who went to work in the South, their children were forced to go to the black segregated schools,
Huh.
not the white schools, the black segregated schools. Italians who came to California in the early 1900s, their kids had to attend the also segregated and racist so-called Mexican schools.
Hmm.
The Mexican schools were public schools that were segregated for the children of Mexican immigrants. Mexican American children were segregated. They were inferior. They were limited education. I write about that in my El Paso book. Limited education, vocational education. The teachers looked down. Teachers had low expectations. I tell my students the worst crime that a teacher can commit is to come into a classroom, look out at their Chicano Latino kids, and think that they cannot be taught at a very high level because they're limited mentally. Intellectually, they're limited. And so this was the nature of the Mexican school. And a lot of those characteristics were still there, by the way, in 1968. Why is what those kids walked out of those schools led by Sal Castro? They said, basta, we're not going to take any more of this stuff. But so
Why is there that attitude? Why do you think that happens in every country? Is this something that's happened since the dawn of civilization, that different groups get treated differently? Some groups get elevated, some groups, get
well,
looked down on?
unfortunately, racism has had a long, long history,
Yeah.
a long, long history. And some people began to think that they're better than others. In the late 19th century, you had what was called social Darwinism that came out of Europe. And it was, in a sense, to kind of study humans in the way that you study, animals, I guess. And so that, of course, that came from Darwin. That for Darwin, the environment, the animal, I mean, there was always the more powerful would survive and be more
Survival of
powerful.
the
But
fittest. Yeah.
so Darwinism was applied socially, therefore the term social Darwinism, and so it was applied to the beginning to classify, quote unquote, classify races, so-called races. Now this comes out of like Western Europe. So lo and behold, of course, it's the white race that's considered the more superior, right?
Because of where it comes from, because it comes out of Western
Right.
Europe. Right.
And so the darker races, those are from Africa, from Latin America, from Asia, they go down in scale, right? So a big surprise. But that's something that passed on. And so when these kids were being taught in El Paso and other areas of the Southwest, that social Darwinism was there. The idea that they belonged to an inferior race. The term
It's
Mexican,
propaganda. It's propaganda that gets
yeah,
passed down for the purpose of social control.
it's all ideology.
All
It's not
ideology.
based. It's not based on science. It's not. There is no such thing. Science doesn't. There are no such scientific things as races. Scientists are better than social scientists and people in the humanity. No, much better. For the scientists, there's no such thing as different races. There's only one race, which is the human race. And yes, of course, there's different colorization, but it's all basically we all have the same basic genetic makeup, right?
Yeah.
Whether you're white, whether you're black, so-called black, white, and so forth. And of course, a lot of it is all over the years have been mixed anyway, But so the term Mexican in the early 20th century, when I did my book on El Paso, and deal with the first big wave of Mexican immigrants to the United States, 1 million, as I said, between 1900 and 1930. And it's a movement that I refer to as the immigrant generation in Chicano history, because again, it's the first mass movement of Mexican immigrants to the United States. And Mexican immigrants will then dominate the Mexican origin communities in the United States. They overwhelm the 19th century communities. Like LA, which had a 19th century and even earlier Spanish Mexican population, into the 1900s, they're overwhelmed by the large number of Mexican immigrants who come. For the exception of northern New Mexico, most of what becomes the Southwest is in the early 1900s is dominated by Mexican immigrants in terms demographically speaking. And so, but the term Mexican, when these immigrants come in such large numbers, unfortunately, they get exposed to American racism. And the term Mexican is racialized. Now, when you think about it, the term Mexican has nothing to do with what we might call a race. Mexican is a term of nationality. Mexican is an ethnic term. It's linked to culture as well. But there's no such thing as a Mexican race. I mean, I wouldn't know what that would mean, because people of Mexican descent, first of all, if you want to use color to designate what a race is, which is what most people do, I don't see how you can classify Mexicans as a race, because Mexicans, as you know, come in all colors,
right?
From very light to very dark. And you look at a country like Mexico, but even you just look at the Mexican American. I look at my students in my class who are Chicanos. Some are light, some are dark, and a lot of them are in between. They're more in the brownish area. And so there's no such thing as a Mexican race. And but a Mexican race is invented in the early 20th century to suggest that these Mexican immigrants belong to an inferior Mexican race, an inferior Mexican race. And therefore their children, those initial Mexican-American kids that are taught in the so-called Mexican schools, are also are part of this inferior Mexican race, and part of that inferiority is that they are not very intelligent people. They don't have a high mental capacity. It's very interesting because this type of discussion of race in the early 20th century lays the foundation for things like the Nazi movement in Germany. Hitler studied how the nativist movement in the United States in the early 20th century. He studied, for example, part of that was the eugenics movement, which again suggested that there were some superior people and some inferior people, the whole social Darwin thing. And Hitler studied that, and that fed into his own Nazism and his own sense of the superiority of the so-called Aryan race, and that the other races were inferior, including the Jews, of course.
Why do you think people do that? Why do you think that one group wants to consider themselves superior, and is it to dominate? Is it our darker angels coming through? Is it kind of just evil, or is there like an economic reason for it? Why do you think this happens?
Power, domination. Who controls the economic resources? Who controls the political system and so forth? So it's related to power, domination. If you can justify it in a racial way, well, you do it, and it has been done, obviously. And so in a way, maybe this is why when those people were saying, I want my white country back, they're basically saying, yeah, because we have been the dominant power. We don't want the people of color now all of a sudden coming in to try to take power away from us. So anyway,
there's insecurity around that.
Yeah, and
like
so you justify it. Yeah, race and racism are ideologies. They're not based on biology. They're not based on science. For example, people who here in this country would be considered non-white, in a country like Brazil would not necessarily be considered non-white. They might be considered part of the white population, mixed people. And here, of course, going back to the beginnings of this country, when the so-called one-drop system began, that if you had one drop of African-American blood, you were considered non-white. Just one drop, you know. So fortunately, unfortunately, in the case of Latin America, Mexico, that one drop never really completely applied because there were too many mixed people anyway. So, you know, there is no way that race has played itself out in the same way in different societies. And that tells you that's why race is not science. Race is an invention.
Mm-hmm.
It's an invention of people's minds to be able to control. So in the Southwest in the early 20th century, where I did my first book, The Desert Immigrants, it's a way of justifying not only the segregation and limited education to these children in the so-called Mexican schools, but it's also a way of dominating and controlling their parents, especially them as working people. I mean, Mexicans came into the Southwest, and many of them were encouraged to come in, brought in by labor contractors, because the Southwestern industries needed labor, primarily cheap labor. The key industries of the Southwest was maintaining the railroads, not necessarily building, but maintaining the railroads, cleaning the railroad ties and all that throughout the Southwest. That's cheap, hard labor that was needed. The mining industries in places like Arizona, lead, copper, silver, ores that were needed for the industrial system back east in the Midwest, that was hard labor as well. And so Mexicans filled that as well. Needless to say, agribusiness, which we still see today. Agribusiness, which today cannot survive without Mexican immigrant labor, which is what the agribusiness owners are telling Trump. Hey, you can't they can't send ICE and Migra into our fields. We can't survive without them, and the country's going to be affected. Talk about raising prices. You raid our fields, and you see the consequences at the grocery stores. So if you want to avoid that, don't raid our fields, Mr. Trump.
I saw I don't know if you caught that weird announcement by the Secretary of Agriculture yesterday about how There's not going to be
No.
any amnesty. We're still going to get people in the fields. We're still going to deport farm workers, but we have to be strategic about it because the food supply is important. And we're also going to stop Chinese nationals from buying farms. So there was this whole other thing. And then she said, and it's all going to be replaced by robots soon anyway. And Medicaid recipients can oversee the robots. I was like, how many of your political points are you trying to hit at one time? But it also exposed their whole playbook. It's like divide and conquer. Hey, Medicaid recipients, we're getting rid of immigrants because they're taking your jobs, but robots are okay because you're going to oversee it. It was weird.
Yeah, well, it's all a way of clearly Trump has crumpled on the pressure by agribusiness, and he's just trying to ease it in a way that suggests that he's not really, or that he's trying to help people in terms of agricultural prices. Well, the part is that all of this, what's going on that we talked about earlier, is all going to affect prices, all going to affect production. People are not going to work if they're fearful that they're going to be jumped upon by those 4 or 5 heavily armed ICE people.
Yeah.
But I wanted to say also that, so key industries like agriculture and so forth, I mean, the reason the immigrants came in and they filled in the early 20th century a basic labor need in the Southwest, including California, in railroad maintenance, mining, agriculture, and in certain areas like LA, eventually urban labor, and construction, which they still do today. I'd like to see the robots build the houses around my neighborhood. Yeah. And there's a number of houses that are going up, and every day I see Mexican and Salvadoran and other Latino workers coming early in the morning to build those houses. And what's always amazing to me is that you may call them unskilled workers, but not really. They're skilled. They know what they're doing, how to construct a house. I mean, how many of us know how to construct a house? And so this goes back to the early 20th century when these industries needed labor, preferably cheap labor. And that's what they got from most of the Mexican immigrant workers. But in order to keep them in that position, you used racist ideology to suggest that they really weren't capable of learning how to do more skilled work. They mentally couldn't be trained to do more skilled work. They were limited. And so you were doing them a favor by giving them employment in the hard, dirty jobs that they were doing and that others would not do and still don't want to do. Anyway, so that's one of the things that people need to realize that, again, when they say, well, these immigrants come in and they take things away from us, they don't really give anything to this country. Again, wrong, just as I mentioned about World War II, how much Latinos gave in that war and all of the other subsequent American wars. And the irony is to see that those Marines that are stationed around the federal building in LA, many of them are Latinos.
So many.
Talk about a paradox, But
what do you think's going through their minds?
Yeah. But they've given, we've given a lot to this country militarily, and we've given a lot through our labor. The Southwest economy in the early 20th century could not have developed in the way that it did successfully without Mexican immigrant labor. And at that time, employers didn't care whether they were documented or undocumented. Talk about an open border. That open border goes back to these employers who forced the immigration officials to say simply, come on in. As long
my
as
mom
I
said her parents were waved in, that they were just like, yeah.
As long as I don't see that you're kind of a diseased person, come on in because we need you, And it's not until the 1920s that more restrictions began to be established. Well, immigration restrictions began to be established. And some people had to come without documents. A lot of those undocumented, and into our present day. It's a two-way story, a two-way street. If you're going to blame Mexicanos and other Latinos for being in this country without documents, you need to also blame the employers who are hiring these undocumented. I want to see those 4 or 5 heavy 200-pound guys with full armament. I want to see them go in to those garment factories that they raided, and I want them to see bringing out those Asian American employers or managers, bringing them out also handcuffed. I want to see them going and arresting the owners of those agribusiness farms in California, here in California. But I want to see them also on the floor being toppled on by these heavy armed guards and then shackled. I want to see that happen too. You cannot just play that one game that the undocumented are just the workers. The undocumented in many ways are the employers in the sense that they're allowing this process to happen because they need these workers one way or another. And the government is in cahoots as well.
Yep.
You know, immigration officials in the past and others. So it's a more complicated system than saying, well, it's just these people coming in. And even if they have come in without documents, as I'm trying to suggest to your listeners, they've contributed. They're not just here to take things away. Come on. In the early 20th century, there was no welfare. There was no Social Security. I mean, if you couldn't work, you died. You know.
You're saying make it racially. If you're going to enforce the law, then make it racially blind, make it status blind, right? And I remember being in at a lawyer conference like 15 years ago, and this corporate attorney was explaining to a bunch of other corporate attorneys how to take advantage of the system and how to hire undocumented immigrants and get away with it. I mean, like at a conference, you know, and obviously that would happen. And I feel like there's been talk about the immigration system being quote unquote broken for decades, but it seems to me that was on purpose. It's kind of like baseball with steroids. It's like we like the home run. So,
it's been broken from the very beginning.
Right.
It's just it's all basically in the attempt to bring in people who are needed as workers. Or the Eastern and Southern Europeans were brought in with almost no documentation. They were undocumented themselves because there was no documentation. You just came in, and if you look healthy enough, bang, come on in. And they formed the labor infrastructure for the rise of industries in this country. They're the ones that worked on the assembly lines. You didn't need to speak English to work on the assembly lines. So this false concept that the ancestors of the white people in this country from Europe, for example, came and they chased the American dream and they fitted in well and all of that, and they learned their English. No, it didn't happen that didn't happen that way. They were brought in largely because industries needed cheap labor. And they became cheap labor, and you didn't need to speak English. You didn't need to be a U.S. citizen. You could be even without any kind of documents, as long as you worked those assembly lines or you worked the packing yards in Chicago and various other kinds of industries that were on the rise, that were making the United States the most powerful industrial country in the world by World War I. Mm-hmm. And the Mexican immigrants in the Southwest were adding to that. Like I said, working in the Arizona mines that were producing the industrial metals that were used for industrialization, or they were working the fields to produce the food to feed those industrial workers back east in the Midwest. So it was all a complementary system in many ways. And immigrants played a key role in that, and people, didn't necessarily always insist that they had to be documented. Certainly employers didn't, and even employers know if the Amigo got rid of all those those workers in the fields, they're not going to have all of these white young people coming in and standing in line and say, "Could I have their jobs? Could you please give me their jobs?" And at the pay that they're getting paid, forget it. The same thing with the construction workers here in my neighborhood. White kids are not going to be in line for that, or the clothing factories in downtown LA. No, I mean, that's not never going to happen.
Why
It's
is
never
that?
happened.
Why is that? Because everyone always says that.
Again, it's the pecking order. It goes back to, again, to the racial order.
Yes.
Why, for white people, young white people, you see, these jobs, the ones we're just referring to, and the ones I'm already referring to in the early 20th century. By the way, in the early 20th century, those jobs that the Mexican immigrants were doing were literally called Mexican jobs.
Hmm.
So it was the jobs were racialized,
Hmm.
Mexican jobs. And the wages that they were being paid were called Mexican wages.
Hmm.
So we were already institutionalizing this race labor class system. And so for whites, getting one of these jobs, like even today, first of all, it's dirty and it's hard work, and they don't feel that they whites should not be doing that. But also because even though we don't call them Mexican jobs anymore, we now refer to them as immigrant jobs.
Hmm.
And for whites, it's a decline in status if you get hired in an immigrant job. There's a status aspect to it as well that goes, no, that white people don't do those jobs.
Because there's a group
Immigrants.
of people who were conditioned to believe this is the job for you. And in the late 1800s, white Europeans were conditioned to believe that's the job for you. But now it's
Yes,
Mexican immigrants that
that's
are
right.
conditioned for it.
Yes, yes. And eventually, some of those Europeans, after a generation or two, like the Irish, but also the Italians and so forth, became more acceptable as whites. Maybe
Right.
not completely, but more acceptable as whites, And so then the pecking order started again. And so the Italians, even earlier, the Irish, the people of Polish background and of German background, they got into the pecking order. And so who do they look down upon? Well, they look down on blacks, and they look down on other immigrants of color like Mexicans and Latinos. There's always that pecking order. And I tell my students when I talk to them about how these Eastern and Southern Europeans were treated so awfully when they came, and even racialized like the Italians. If people today, including the students in my class who are Anglo-Americans, if they knew this history of their ancestors and how awful they were treated, not a single white person of that kind of background would ever dare to be anti-immigrant, would never dare to become a nativist, meaning spewing anti-immigrant propaganda, because they would know, hey, my ancestors were treated just like that. And if I were to see my ancestors jumped upon by those ice people, that would be like my great grandfather. I can't support this kind of nativism. But see, we started talking. I mean, we don't teach history very well in this country, and so kids don't know history, and they don't learn from it, and they don't approach history critically, and that's what Trump and these others who want to establish authoritarianism, they want to make sure that the kids don't learn much from that history anyway.
Is it
They
because
don't
we're
want to
not
learn how
taught?
awful. They don't want them to learn how awful their ancestors were treated.
Okay, because I was going to ask, is it that we're not taught the right things, or that we're not taught to be independent thinkers, or both?
Both. Well, I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, let me say that, put it this way. I think the way we teach, like American history, still has its limitations. I don't know that we teach the full gamut of American history. I mean, one of the things of my work and others have been trying to expand our meaning of American history so that we're more inclusive, so that we include all people who, as Americans, have added to the history of this country. Because for too long, it was only certain groups, those from Western Europe or from Europe, and the rest were just not really dealt with. So yeah, I think our teaching history has become certainly more inclusive. But how well we teach it is another matter. How well we do it in a way that makes the kids really think critically How do teachers, for example, teach the way that I've just been, in a sense, teaching right now, from a critical perspective, raising issues and questions that still relate to us today on immigration and so forth, on race and so forth. I don't know how widely that is, maybe in the more advanced classes. But I mean, I went to school, and I know in other schools as well, although I went to Catholic schools, but even there, I always ask the question, how come in the high schools, it's always the football coaches that teach American history? I don't know in your case, but why is it the football coach? You know why? Because they think, well, we have to give them some classes, and so teaching American history is pretty simple. It's not a class that will be too demanding, right? It should be demanding, and it should be very critically done by people who know what they're teaching. But I don't know that the football coaches all knew that. Or knew that history. So, so we pay we get what we pay for, we reap what we sow. And
or maybe it's kind of intentional, right? Kind of intentional.
And then on top of that, even what we have that is more inclusive of history and maybe more critical, this is what the Trumpites want to roll back. They want to roll back that. They don't want any way of teaching history that raises any serious questions about problems that we've had in this country. This is a ridiculous, ignorant way of looking at how you teach any history. Yes, of course, you teach what some might consider the more positive aspects, although that's, I don't know what that means. But we have to understand what have been some of the drawbacks or the limitations of American history. I mean, it all comes together. Chicanos, as I mentioned, economically and in any other ways, have contributed to this country. Adding and talking about the history of issues like on race, of class divisions and so forth, that's not an attempt to tear down the United States. It's an attempt to make us understand more the full complexities of how the society has functioned and the way we need to continue to work to improve it. So to work to improve it is not anti-American, it's pro-American. But to be pro-American, you can't put your head in the sand and all of a sudden say, well, no, I don't think we need to talk too much about slavery. That's kind of maybe upset the kids a bit. We shouldn't talk too much about the fact that, blacks, if they stood up or something and were against the kind of racism, were hung, that kind of stuff. So we don't want to show, that workers at some point began to go on strike to force industries to pay them decent wage. No, that might upset the kids. No, it's not going to upset the kids. Not at all. And it's going to enlighten them. It'll give them a fuller and better understanding of what this country is all about. And if anything, it's going to make them better Americans.
We're like understanding Mexican repatriation. I didn't know about that. I wasn't taught about that. And I learned about that recently.
There you go. Yeah, this is not repatriation or deportation. It's not new when it comes to Mexicans in this country. The first mass deportations were in the 1930s. Mexicans in places like Southern California in the early 1930s were blamed for the Great Depression. They said, well, these people are here and they're taking jobs away from real Americans. So, hey, how come I didn't hear that earlier? When immigrants were coming in and picking the food and working in the Arizona mines and working on, how come I didn't hear that? The real Americans needed those jobs. I didn't hear that. But now I'm hearing it. Do you want those jobs now? Okay, yeah, but don't blame the Mexicans. They were adding to the wealth of this country. They didn't create the Great Depression. They're suffering from the Great Depression as well, even more so, because they had less. And so, as I tell my students again, if something goes wrong with if we run into a problem, how many of us have often said, well, no, but it's not, I didn't create the problem. You created the problem. You created the problem. Someone else created the problem. I didn't create the problem. If I get a D or an F in Professor Garcia's class, no, I'm not the problem. Professor Garcia is the problem. He's the one who didn't do whatever he needed to do to make sure that I got my A or my B. No, so we try to blame others, right? We always try to pass the buck. Someone else someone else created the. So in the early 30s, Mexicans were blamed for the Great Depression, and about 500,000. Some scholars are now suggesting even more, maybe even closer to 1 million Mexicans. I want to say Mexicans were sent. I don't want to say back to Mexico. Were sent to Mexico. Were sent to Mexico.
Because it was a mix of citizens and non-citizens, right?
Right, and that's why I didn't want to say back to Mexico, because some of the people that were sent had never been in Mexico.
Yeah,
it wasn't. There was no going back to. They were born and raised. These were the children. These were the kids, and so when whole families were deported, and there's threats of that happening. That happened in the first Trump administration. It's happening today. Immigration officials in the early 30s never stopped to think, well, are any of these family members U.S. citizens? No, if they were Mexicans, they were Mexican, and they were immigrants, and if they were immigrants, they were probably here without documents. Out you go. Out you go. So that was the first mass deportation.
And that was political scapegoating. So it was, hey, we had
political scapegoating.
Yeah.
Yes, it was. And they used the term repatriation. Now, I always have to explain to my students what's the difference between repatriation and deportation. Well, repatriation is just a nicer name for deportation. All it means is that you're told that if you don't leave voluntarily, you won't have a job, you won't be given any kind of welfare, you won't be given any kind of resources, and you won't be given any kind of legal protection, so you might as well go. If that isn't deportation, I don't know what is. It's just a nicer word. Repatriation.
Yeah.
Yeah, coercion. In 1954, in the 1950s, there was so-called, and I always have to tell people, it uses a racist term, wetback. There was what was called Operation Wetback in 1954. And it's estimated that there, maybe as high as 1 million, again, predominantly Mexicans, were sent to Mexico. How many were U.S. born? We don't know. It's just like we don't know in the early 1930s, but undoubtedly, if families were deported, some were U.S. born kids, children as well. And again, that had to do with economic issues. It had to do with the Red Scare, or maybe they thought that all these Mexicans were communists. And in fact, it's Operation Wetback that Trump has said, that's what I'm trying to emulate. I want to do what President Eisenhower did and get the credit for deporting maybe as many as 1 million. Well, he wants them all out. It's estimated about 11 million. There's about 11 undocumented. And by the way, they're not all Mexicans. They're not all Latino. There are whites who are also undocumented. There's a lot of Irish that are undocumented in places like Boston and so forth. So people from other... And
Russians and Persians and Afghans.
Oh yeah, so you'd have, but anyway, so deportation is not something new to the history that of Mexicans in this country, and the effort to deport quote unquote illegal aliens and undocumented has a long history. I mean, that's the reason Bert Corona in the 60s already was starting to organize the undocumented to protect themselves. The efforts to deport the undocumented has a long history, but certainly it was there in the 60s, it was there in the 70s, and it's been continuous ever since.
So part of his work was a reaction to Operation Wetback.
Yeah, we had those propositions in the 90s that were aimed at the undocumented. Proposition 184 in 1994 was to deprive the undocumented any kind of public services, including emergency services in hospitals. It would deny if their kids also came undocumented. They would deny them public education. It was a very severe, repressive, and racist efforts to limit the undocumented. So, in terms of contemporary history, if you mean by beginning in the 60s or 70s, as contemporary history, we've had a lot of it already. This is nothing new. It's just that it's being done in a much more vicious and ugly way.
Much more vicious way, and then like also eating away at constitutional rights in a weird new way, right? More fascist and authoritarian than before. At least that's what it seems like. Is that accurate?
Yes, all of it is true, I think. Yeah, it's denying people their rights. You know,
Yes, it happened before, but it feels like more of an onslaught. Yeah.
Bert Corona often said that, and he told the undocumented as he was organizing undocumented, if you're stopped by the immigration officials, you don't have to tell them anything. You don't have to say whether you have documents or not. It's they and the legal system that has to prove that you're not documented.
Right.
You're not the one you're not the one who has to prove it. They have to prove it.
Right.
Well, people who are being rounded up in the way that we've seen recently in LA and others are not being given the right to hearings. They're not given the right to let those who are accusing them of being undocumented of proving that they're undocumented. And so, talk about racial profiling. I mean, even though the administration denies it, of course, it's all being done on racial profiling. They're stopping anyone that looks Mexican or Latino, or what these people consider to be Mexican or Latino. Like we said earlier, Mexicans come in all colors. So, but I suspect they're stopping mostly the ones who are of darker complexion, right? Because they think, when they think these immigration officials, when they think Mexicans, they think people who are darker skin. So that's what's happening, and it's clear racial profiling. So again, but there's a long history of that, and we need to be aware that there's a long history of that. That's why when you know that, you can think about these things more clearly and more critically and say, well, wait a minute, that's been done before. It was a bad thing then, it's a bad thing now, and we have to move beyond it.
What can we learn from the history? What can we learn from the history we were just talking about and apply it to today and the way leaders fought back?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, yeah, so, you know, again, what I'm been concerned about is showing how, because you could say, well, here's another case of Mexicans and other Latinos being victimized, and it is true they are being victimized. But I want to show the other side, and the other side is what we saw in the recent protests in the streets and so forth. That's people making history. And so going back to the Mexican-American book where I interviewed your grandfather, E.B. Leon, that was to show Mexican-Americans making history already in the 30s, 40s, and 50s through organizing in civil rights organizations. I was mentioning how those 500,000 Latinos, mostly Mexicans who fought in World War II, when they came back, unfortunately, they still found being treated racially in racist way. Some could not be. There are accounts of some of the Mexican American veterans coming back to places like Texas and still wearing their uniforms, their U.S. uniforms, and going to be served in cafes and being denied service because they were Mexicanos. Here they just fought for their country. They got the uniform, not of the Mexican army, the U.S. Army. And they said, no, you can't, we don't serve Mexicans here. So they found stuff like that. With a GI Bill, they tried to buy homes, and they could buy homes, but that sometimes realtors they would redline, and they would not allow Mexicans to buy in certain neighborhoods to keep them out of white neighborhoods. So they found stuff like that. And so many of these veterans came together starting in Texas, and they organized what was called the American GI Forum. And the American GI Forum becomes a major Mexican-American civil rights organization, along with groups like LULAC and several others. But the American GI Forum becomes very important because it's composed predominantly of veterans, and it's still functioning today. It's still very important. It's still protesting against what's happening against immigrants today as well. And so that's the kind of history that I wanted to show in my Mexican-American book. I wanted to show how in the case of working class Mexicans, how already, as I mentioned, in the 30s and 40s, they began to organize into those CIO unions like Bert Corona and others. So to me, showing how Mexicans make history is important because, again, if you just show the victim side of history, get people think, well, there's nothing we can do. That's just the way things are. We're just victims. But no, we've also been makers of history through civil rights organizations, to joining labor unions, to engaging in other kinds of protest, in voting, in being involved in campaigns to promote more Mexican-American, Latino candidates. So in the book, as you know, I have a chapter on the election of Raymond Tellez as mayor of El Paso in 1957, which was a huge breakthrough. And it showed how Mexican Americans made history through the political system, through using the electoral system to try to deal with another area of discrimination, which was political or electoral discrimination, where in the case of El Paso, for example, over time, some Mexican Americans, very few were elected. Like in the early 50s, there was one Mexican American elected to the city council, and some were at lesser offices like justices of peace and so forth, but never becoming like mayor. And in the case of El Paso in 1957, half, if not more than half, of that community of about 100,000 plus was of Mexican-American background or of Mexican background. And Mexican Americans, it included many veterans. Raymond Tellez himself was a veteran, said to themselves, no, it's time. We fought for this country. We paid our dues. We need to show that we can run our own city, which has so many Mexicans in it. We'll run the city for everyone, but we can't any longer accept being excluded like from the mayorship. So we're going to attempt to elect a Mexican American. And so they chose Tellez because he had a bit more education, meaning at that time that he had a high school education. And he was a decorated Mexican American officer because he was an officer in World War II and he was decorated. And so they felt that he was the perfect candidate that they could run. How could people question his credentials and all of that? Well, they did, and Raymond Tellez they first showed their political muscle in El Paso. Again, another way of making history, of making changes, another way of how you could fight against injustice. They came together, these Mexican-American leaders, so forth, veterans, and they first convinced Tellez to run for a county clerk in 1948. And the reason they chose that position, Stefan, was because the county clerk position, it was countywide. So it was countywide voting. That meant it would give some evidence of whether a Mexican American could win a countywide as well as a citywide election. Wow. Tellez won that election. And so that gave Mexican Americans a sense we can win also at the city level. So they waited till 1957. They felt this is the time. And they convinced Tellez again to run for the mayorship. And there's a story in my...
He won that first election?
It was in 1948.
Did he win that election?
Yes, he won that. He was the county clerk.
Okay.
The county clerk. And then in 1957, when Tejas agreed to run for the mayor of El Paso, he first went to the Anglo head of the El Paso National Bank, one of the more powerful Anglo part of the ruling class in El Paso. They were called the kingmakers. And this guy, the head of the El Paso National Bank, was one of those kingmakers. And Raymond Tejas went to his office and he said, I forget what the guy, the kingmaker's name was, but Tejas told him that he just thinking. He said, I'm thinking of running for mayor of El Paso in this coming election. And this kingmaker, the head of the El Paso National Bank, according to Tejas, practically almost had a heart attack right there. And he said to Raymond, he said, Raymond, in my lifetime, he said, no Mexican will ever be elected mayor.
Oh, man.
In my lifetime, no Mexican will be elected mayor. Well, he had to eat that because Raymond Tejas, a Mexican-American, was elected mayor. It was a tremendous show of Mexican-American electoral power. They voted in droves from South El Paso, from the lower valley. He won the Mexican precincts by huge percentages, but he also knew that he had to cut into the Anglo vote to get at least the liberal Anglo vote, and he was able to cut into that as well. So altogether, he had an impressive vote count and won strongly against his Anglo opponent. And he served two terms, they were of 2 years each, and he did an excellent job as mayor. He showed that, of course, a Mexican-American could effectively run the city and so forth, and not just for Mexican-American, but for all. So my book on the Mexican-American, what I call the Mexican-American generation, which is Raymond Tejas' generation, your grandfather's generation, U.S.-born Mexican-Americans who now were fighting for their full rights, their full civil rights and so forth. They knew that they might be told by some racist Anglo white guy, say, go back to Mexico. But your grandfather would say, well, wait a minute, I was born here. There's no going back for me. This is where I was born, in El Paso. I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to stay here and I'm going to fight for my rights, as he did through a group like LULAC. And so that book on Mexico, that's the Mexican-American generation. That's the first large-scale generation of U.S.-born Mexican-Americans in the United States. They're the children predominantly of those million-plus immigrants that came in the early 20th century. And now they're coming of age in the 30s and 40s. That's the ones that go to war in World War II and later go to Korea. And their grandchildren go to Vietnam. And their great-grandchildren will go to Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah.
All giving to this country.
Now, the election of Raymond Tejas was important for at least a couple of reasons. It sounds like it was important to flex political muscle, that was one aspect of it, to show, hey,
yes,
we have political power, pay attention to us, let's engage here. Number two, it sounds like it was an important thing symbolically to show, hey, we can have these roles and do a great job, as he did. And then I'm guessing part of it was to show our people, hey, look, we can do this.
We can do it. We can do it. So there are different avenues of how to bring about change. And today, given the very, very significant effort to roll back democracy in this country, we have to take advantage. Good meaning Americans of all backgrounds need to use different ways of fighting back. One is using the electoral system and voting for candidates and promoting candidates that have the courage to want to make a change, a real change in this country. And of course, people power again, making sure our kids get a good education, a critical education, working with civil rights organizations, supporting the legal system, like in your case, to help fund pro bono lawyers for the immigrants who are being attacked, who are not being given their right, to give them a chance to fight back as well. So there's all kinds of things that each of us individually can do in one way or another. I'm retired. I've been retired for 3 years, but I still am teaching one of my Chicano history classes every year because I want to still give some of my, at least even a limited number of my students, some of the kind of history that I've just discussed with you, a sense of how that history has evolved. Because as I tell them, this information that I'm passing on to you, this kind of critical analysis of Chicano history, is in a way is to give you the at least the information to fight back with, to argue back with, to articulate a different point of view. And some of those examples I've already mentioned, but for example, again, when you hear some kind of white nativist racist Trumpite say, well, you know, all your people have come and have given nothing to this country. I tell myself, you tell that white racist, 500,000 of us, 500,000 Mexicanos and other Latinos fought for you and for your people as well in World War II alone. And even earlier in World War I, thousands of Mexican Americans were in World War I. Not to mention the other. You tell that white racist, that 500,000. But see, if you didn't learn that from me, how would you respond? Well, how do you fight back? You need to arm yourself. And I don't mean in a violent way, but intellectually, knowledge-wise, to articulate a counterposition, a more positive position of how we need to see how all of us have contributed, not just some, but all of us. And so if we have a way of knowing all of this history and bringing it together, maybe that helps people begin to understand other people that they're less familiar with, right? If you don't know the stranger, you're going to be suspicious of the stranger. Mm-hmm. And the strangers today are being made out to be immigrants, strangers. So we need to fight back by trying to show in various ways through blogs like this, through other media, using other media, using classes, education, other ways of informing people about who these quote unquote strangers are and what they have contributed to this country, going back a long ways, as we mentioned in our discussion. Those strangers coming in the early 20th century, well, those strangers gave a lot to this country in terms of their blood, sweat, and tear, their labor. And then that Mexican-American generation, strangers, they gave a lot to this country. They're the one who went to fight for World War II and to expand political rights, like in the election of Tejas, expand economic rights by labor rights, by working with the unions and struggling with the unions to force employers to pay a decent, livable wage. So all these so-called strangers have added to the history of this country and make this country better. But you got to know the stranger. You've got to know. And then also, you know, I'm glad to see, because I've also written about the role of religion in Chicano history. I'm glad to see some of the clergy of different faiths being involved right now in terms of trying to help the immigrants who are being pounced upon and so forth, and being out there with the people, also marching and so forth, and in their robes. The people need to see how people of faith and the clergy are also very much engaged and reminding people that, well, let me first add that one of my more recent books is a biography, not a testimonio, but a biography of Father Luis Olivares. And he was an incredible person who is best known for his work in the sanctuary movement of the 1980s. Father Olivares was a Claretian priest of a Claretian order, and he was the pastor of La Placita Church, right there right off of Olvera Street. Everyone in LA knows where La Placita Church. A lot of Latinos have been baptized in La Placita Church. You know, and Luis Olivares was the pastor there in the early 80s. And this is when the Central Americans were coming in large numbers. And they were coming in without documents. They were coming in to be hopefully accepted as legitimate refugees because they were fleeing an awful persecution in El Salvador, a civil war in El Salvador. And some also from Guatemala, where you had military repression. People were coming up to ask for asylum, to ask for refugee status. Unfortunately, the then Ronald Reagan administration denied them that, just like the Trump administration is denying legitimate refugees also this kind of protection, because Reagan said, oh no, these are not legitimate political refugees. They're quote unquote illegal aliens coming in to try to take jobs from real Americans. Well, that was untrue. And the fact is that they met the criteria of being legitimate political refugees because prior to Reagan's election in 1980, President Carter and the Carter administration in 1978 or 79 had signed on to a United Nations resolution or position that defined who a legitimate political refugee was. And a legitimate political refugee, very simply put, was one who, if sent back to their home countries, would either be tortured, killed, or both. And that was certainly true of all these refugees coming in from Central America. And so, because the government here refused to give them any sense of any protection, a lot of good Americans, and a lot of them were good people in the churches and synagogues who came forth and began to develop what became the sanctuary movement of the 1980s, where churches proclaimed themselves to be sanctuaries and proclaimed themselves to be places where the refugees could come and receive assistance of any kind that they needed. Father Olivares was part of that sanctuary movement. But Olivares did a lot more than just simply verbalize his support for the refugees. He put into operation in La Placita Church the most extensive sanctuary program anywhere in the country. He put together committees, and others who worked with him, ways of providing concrete assistance to the refugees, because a lot of churches and even synagogues, basically when they said that they were declaring sanctuary, but they weren't providing any kind of infrastructure. They were just simply verbalizing support for the refugees. Olivares did that, but he did more than that. He provided concrete program, housing. He got them housing, including allowing at least the men to sleep overnight in the church itself. That became very controversial. There was pictures in the LA Times about that, seeing people sleeping on the pews and so forth. But he did that because there was nowhere else for them to sleep. And so he did it on a rotating basis. But for women and family, they find them other alternative housing in apartments and so forth, where they could be housed adequately. They provided food for people coming in. They would always have food there at La Placita and so forth. They would provide them getting their kids into the public schools. They provide them medical assistance. Some of them had been tortured, so they needed medical treatment. Some of them came with a lot of psychological issues because some of their families had been tortured, some had been killed. So they got them that kind of medical assistance. They got them legal assistance, where they got pro bono attorneys to help them see how they could try to regularize their situation. Very few were able to do that. I think in the 1980s, of about 1 million Salvadorians, for example, that came to the United States, only about maybe 5 or less % actually were able to legally regularize their situation. They helped with people who wanted to go all the way to Canada, where the Canadian government was a little bit more liberal in terms of providing refugee status. They provide them with a form of the Underground Railroad to get them to Canada.
Huh.
So at all levels, besides Olivares speaking and being part of groups that were protesting against Reagan and calling for refugee status for the immigrants, protesting against Reagan's war policies in Central America and trying to overthrow the Sandinista government, supporting terrible military regimes in Guatemala and El Salvador and so forth. And Olivares was at the head of all this. He was an incredible person, charismatic, articulate, caring. And he would always say, he said, I can't deny these refugees. He said, I look at them and I see the face of Jesus, and I cannot deny them. I have to embrace them. And people would say, well, but aren't you breaking the law by doing this? And he said, for me, there's always a superior law, and that's God's law. And God's law is to protect all of his children. That's what you don't see with those people pouncing, those ICE people. You don't see them looking at those immigrants as children of God. You don't see that. You don't see Trump talking about immigrants with a sense that they're all children of God as he is a children of God. And all these people think, and the Reagan administration and others, all these Trumpites who cloth themselves with religion and Christianity, but they're not really doing God's will. God's will is not to hurt these people. It's to help them. What's the Jesus story if it isn't helping other people? And then Olivares would also point out the contradiction. He said, well, they say I'm breaking the law, but it's really the Reagan administration is breaking the law. They're breaking the law, U.S. law, which is based on that UN resolution of defining legitimate political refugees. They're breaking that law. We signed a treaty to that effect, and a treaty, is as part of U.S. law.
I mean, there's the law and there's morality, right? And they're not always the same thing. Yeah.
So Olivares was incredible, and I'm glad to see that today some of his fellow religious clergy people are also following, to some extent, in his path. But
it does make a difference,
because we need to get people
seems to make a difference.
People...
I've gone to some of these interfaith vigils, and it does have a certain power, right? Why is that? In people's minds, there's a certain reverence still for the clergy, yeah?
Yes, I think so, all of that. That's why you need, I'm glad to hear that Archbishop Gomez, he's not particularly of that mind to speak out against authority, but at least he's spoken out on protection of the immigrants and so forth. And of course he should, because who are his constituents? Who are his parishioners today in the LA Archdiocese? They're basically Latinos, right?
Yeah.
If it wasn't for the Latino Catholics, we wouldn't have these Catholic churches and parishes anymore, because they're the parishioners now, overwhelmingly. And that's true for the rest of the country. There's Latino Catholics all over. A lot of parishes all over the country have become Latino parishes. So it's to the Catholic Church's interest to support them. And but Olivares faced a lot of negative reaction, even by his own church and so forth, but he was always courageous and always spoke out for the refugees. So we need people like that. We need role models. In a way, part of the work, Stefan, that I do as a historian, like doing these testimonials of key leaders like Bert Corona, Sal Castro, writing about the Mexican-American generation's civil rights struggles, by writing about Father Olivares, is to provide role models for our younger people, for our students, so that they can see that history has been made by people that look like them, people that carry their names, people that come from the same backgrounds and so forth. And if they can make history, the younger generation today can make history too. And I know that they know that because I see them out in the streets. See them pro, but it has to be nonviolent because I see too many young people who sometimes start throwing things and so forth. What they don't understand is that that's what the media jumps on. That's what the opposition jumps on. And everything else, the 99% who are they're marching and protesting peacefully and so forth, all of that gets put aside. And so they're doing no favor by striking out. So young people have to understand that they also have to come together peacefully and organize and contribute in that way. You know,
in the spirit of Gandhi, MLK, Cesar Chavez.
Absolutely. And it takes more courage. You're more of a macho if you're marching peacefully in the streets and standing up to unlawful laws and unlawful procedures that are being done to, in this case, immigrants. It takes being more of a macho to do that. Than it's very easy to strike back, to throw something at someone or to break a window. That doesn't take very much. So the kids have to understand that they really want to be contributors and involved. Those who might have a tendency to do these things become part of the whole peaceful process. So everyone needs role models. Our kids need role models. Our students need role models. People who know, how they've been able to change history and the contributions of people. One of the problems is that Mexican Latino immigrants have a long history, and we've talked about that already. And if people in general knew about the contribution of Latino Mexican immigrants to this country, maybe they would be a little bit less willing to say, oh, well, all these people, they shouldn't be here anyway. They're breaking the law. Well, who's breaking what law? What?
That makes so much sense to me. And everything you're saying resonates with me so much because, number one, I didn't know about a lot of these role models growing up. I didn't. What I saw a lot of was like kids in my neighborhood on the street corners in handcuffs, or
Right.
I knew about some role models like Cesar Chavez, but I didn't know about so much of our history. And as I became more aware as an adult, I realized that all the negative propaganda against our people worked on me too. Like I had self-esteem struggles because of the propaganda. I limited myself. I was more humble and played smaller than I should have played, even going to Stanford. And actually going to Stanford, the only student organization that didn't get funding every year was MECHA.
Mm.
The only one. And we had so much money and it didn't come out of our pockets. It came out of, and so there was all this bigotry that I became more aware of as I got older and got into more of a position of power, because the closer I get to the center of power, the more I see it.
Mm-hmm.
The more I see it.
Yeah.
So I don't know, everything you're saying resonates so much, and it means so much, means so much to me, all the work you've done, because there was this in my subconscious.
Yeah.
There was this positive story. There was my grandfather's positive story, your work.
Yeah.
And I think it has a powerful impact. I mean, you really helped lead the way on developing Chicano studies in this country. And I think it makes a huge difference. And I do see young people right now, standing up prouder than ever, bigger than ever, and showing up. And I think what you're saying is true. We have to fight, not non-violently. Yes, of course. And I agree. It's more macho than ever before. And I see leaders sprouting out, rising to the moment.
Right.
And I'm curious. I mean, you've talked this whole time about all the different leaders you've studied and you've written about. And I want to identify leaders in our community right now. I want to have them on this podcast. I want to support them. What's the common thread you see in leaders that have been successful? What should we be looking towards? Or if somebody wants to be a leader and do more, what kind of characteristics matter? What should they be thinking about? That sort of thing.
Well, that's a good question too. I mean, I think the people that I've studied, are kind of joined together. People They're people of courage. They're people of integrity. They're people that have a sense of morality, of what's right and what's wrong. People have a sense of justice versus injustice. And so people who have that kind of character and who are willing to stand up and not to bend, not to give in to intimidation, and so forth, and to realize that that the main thing is to make sure that everyone gets their full and equal rights in this country, and it takes work. It takes work and it takes commitment, and so people who are committed and who are willing to help others. I mean, those are kind of the characteristics that I think kind of binds all of the people that I've studied. I'm sure your grandfather had all of those characteristics as well. And so those are the kinds of leaders that I think we want to emulate, and we want our young people to emulate. And I see that in my students as well. You know, many of them are committed on our campus. They're out there, you know, working on their studies and all of that, but they're out there also protesting against injustices. They're protesting against, and we're protesting against the injustices being done to Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and so forth. In a way that they see those injustices, as they've learned about the injustices that has happened in this country to other people, to some of our people. They make the connections, and so that's important. So I think those are the kind of role models we want to emulate and to try to promote and so forth. And we don't need opportunists. We don't need people who are going to say, yeah, look, I'm going to be a leader, but, you know, there's a price for it. And, you know, you're willing to pay that price to Trump or to someone else to be accepted as such and to be a spokesperson, but you're really already more committed to the other side than you are to the right side. So, you know, it takes people of integrity.
And you mentioned courage. I mean, you mentioned courage, like I guess it's a scary thing in some ways to speak out right now, huh?
Yes, it is. I'm sure. Yeah, I mean, but we know what, as I said it earlier, we know what the alternative is. The alternative is that the bully gets its way, and the authoritarianism continues to be set in. It's when people begin to stand up and say, no, 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 this is not the way the country it needs to go. It's not holding up the values that we say that we stand up for justice and morality and full rights to all citizens and so forth and so on. People, people need to stand up and articulate that and to protest for those rights. The other side doesn't want that reaction. And so it's important that people speak up. It can get scary, it can get intimidating, but see, that's the whole point, is to make it intimidating. Seeing those guys with all that gear, that we've mentioned them several times now, who pounce on the immigrants, they're pouncing not just on that immigrant, they're pouncing on the rest of us. They're saying, if you get out of line, doesn't matter whether you're a citizen or not, we're going to come after you too. So that intimidation is not just for the immigrants, it's for the rest of us. And so we can't allow that. And I'm glad so many people are not allowing that and are standing up for it. It's the only way to do it, and to do it in the other ways that we can, organizing, protesting, supporting candidates that are going to make a positive change and so forth. And it doesn't mean that you don't have, sometimes we have to compromise with everything that we want, and you take what you can. Maybe the Democrats that are going to run for office next year, where hopefully the Democrats can gain control of the House and hopefully of the Senate too. They may not all be the kind of people that I would necessarily say have all the characteristics we just mentioned.
Oh,
But sometimes you have to make a compromise, a strategic compromise, and say, okay, but at least we'll be able to be better off strategically if Democrats can control the Congress, and then we go from there. And we push the Democrats now to make sure that some of the rights that have been taken already and programs to help working people and poor people and so forth are reinstated. So sometimes it can be that it's either my way or no way. I mean, yeah, but yes, we want our way, but we need to make some adjustments as we go along in that struggle.
thank you so much for all your wise words.
Well, listen,
Yeah,
thank you so much for allowing me to be on your program, and good luck to you. And this is again a way of fighting back and of getting the word out and people articulating the things that will support all of us as we go forward in trying to make sure that we don't lose our democracy.
that's the prayer, and bringing you on is a way of doing all the things you just mentioned that are important. And so I hope people learned a lot. I hope
I
they
hope
check
so.
out your books and check out your history, but also all the people you just talked about, and that we get inspired by it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Stephen.
Thanks so much.
Good luck to you. We'll be in touch.
Okay, appreciate you.
Bye-bye.